Hello everyone, it is Adam Winter here again. Today I'm going to be showing off my book collection. I did a CD collection video earlier this year, which was the first video I'd ever done, kind of like a talking thing, showing off stuff. And I enjoyed that one, so now I want to do my books. Because I just got these books out of storage. They've been in cardboard boxes for like a year or two. And I finally got myself a bookshelf again, and just put them back on the shelf, and yeah, I felt like showing off my collection. I have 116 books total here. I counted them yesterday. And then I also have 18 audiobooks, which I'll go over at the end. It's not as cool not being able to physically show off, but I'll go over the audiobooks just to kind of show what else I've read or listened to. So I've been building this book collection for, 18 years? Since I was 11 years old. Obviously I learned how to read in school, and I would read whatever I had to read for school before that, but I didn't really become like a serious reader and actually enjoy reading till I was 11. And the book that started it for me, I'll show it to you later, but it's Aragon by Christopher Paolini, and it's a fantasy young adult fiction novel, and that's what really got me actually interested in reading. That was the first book I really enjoyed, and you'll kind of see a lot of my literary preferences follow from that, starting with like a fantasy novel. There's a lot of fiction in here, nonfiction as well. As a teenager, I pretty much only read fiction, novels, but in my early adult years, especially early 20s, I started reading a lot more nonfiction as well. And the shelf is actually kind of chronologically set up that way, because I've got the fiction at the top, then we go down, and the nonfiction is all at the bottom. As far as organization, everything is in 4 kind of broad categories, and then within each one of those categories, it's roughly chronological. There's some exceptions where I'll group authors or certain things together, but it's roughly chronological within each category. And the 4 categories are, first, Tolkien, because he gets a whole category to himself, because I have so many Tolkien books. Then we have fiction, which more accurately you could say is like modern novels. And then we have nonfiction, which is pretty broad. There's quite a bit of different stuff in there. I include ancient works of mythology and epic poetry in there, because you may consider those to be fictional stories, but I think the people at the time, writing or telling those stories through oral tradition would have considered them very real. And then the last category is audiobooks, which of course I won't be able to show physically, but I'll go over them anyhow. And it's funny because the audiobooks kind of do form a genre category, because pretty much everything I've listened to on audiobook has been an autobiography. A few exceptions, but yeah, they're pretty much all autobiographical. I got into this, habit of listening to audiobooks while driving that were specifically autobiographies, so it kind of works out nicely that way. Okay, so let's not waste any more time. Let's get into the books. We'll start with Tolkien, like I said. First, I have this nice fancy edition of The Hobbit that my brother and his wife got for me one Christmas. Pull that out. It's got a nice case. Very nice looking. I'll try to show the books physically. I'm not sure how it's going to work out from this angle, but yeah, very nice quality paper and clear printing. And it's got these interesting kind of green highlights. The illustrations, which are black and white, they've even put into this kind of green tint, which looks pretty cool. So yeah, The Hobbit, of course, is where it all starts with Tolkien, his first popular book, and what led to The Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien is my favorite author, if you haven't noticed. After Paolini, with the Aragon Inheritance Cycle series, Tolkien, Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings were the next things I read, and I loved them even more, so that's what really got me to be like a serious reader. Now we have my other Hobbit, just my regular plain hardback Hobbit. Oh yeah, and I should note that most of my hardback books do not have the dust jackets on them, because I like the way a book looks better, just like this, just plain black or whatever with the gold lettering. I just like that look better. I don't really care for the dust jackets, and whenever I'm reading too, they're like, I find them cumbersome and they just get in the way. So yeah. You'll see very few dust jackets in here. There's a few exceptions where there was a book that I really liked the illustration and I kept the dust jacket. But anyway, so here's my Hobbit hardcover, hardback. And yeah, Hobbit, really nice book. Of course, it's more of a children's book, but it's the kind of children's book that can be enjoyed by adults as well. And this actually has some nice color illustrations in it as well that you don't always get. A lot of editions just have the black and white ones. So now we get to Lord of the Rings. And this is my favorite book of all time, The Lord of the Rings, and it always will be. Like I say, it was pretty early on. I got into Lord of the Rings when I was 12, 13 years old. And just the immersiveness of the world, the escape from the modern world into this fantasy, kind of ancient, medieval-inspired fantasy world. And it really, Lord of the Rings, I always liked animals and things like that and being outside, but Lord of the Rings really increased my love of nature and the outdoors and the beauty of landscapes and things like that, and just sort of a down-to-earth rootedness in, like the non-modern, non-industrialized world. And so, yeah, reading Lord of the Rings as a teenager, which I read it many times, had a big impact on my kind of tastes and views for things in the world, And so I actually have written here all the times that I've read it. This isn't the first copy I've owned of Lord of the Rings. I had a 1-volume paperback and then a 3-volume paperback, and then I finally got this nice hardcover one. And so I got it in 2015, and all my books I signed with my name in the year I got it. But here I have listed all the readings and the dates of when I read Lord of the Rings. So I've read through it 7 times. The last time was actually earlier this year. And I always read it in the winter because the book takes place in the winter for the most part. Most of the story takes place in the winter. The first time I read it happened to be in the winter, and so I always just keep that tradition up, read it, kind of in the winter time. But yeah, it's a pretty standard hardback. I think this is the 50th anniversary edition, which just means it's like a more accurate, updated text. But yeah, nice printing. Of course, Lord of the Rings doesn't really have illustrations in it. Well, there probably are copies that do. But you just have the occasional things like this. But yeah, very nice hardback Lord of the Rings. Alright, and then we have the Silmarillion, and this is a really nice big illustrated hardback, and it's the only one I've ever owned. I was lucky to get this one right from the beginning. And it's a bit worn out because I didn't used to be quite so careful with my books. You can see there it's a little bit fragile. But this was illustrated by Ted Naismith, or Nesmith, however you say his name. Just the printing alone is really nice. It's like these glossy pages, really clear, crisp kind of printing. This has some really nice illustrations in it. Yeah, this one here, I always thought this was a really cool picture. It's crazy. Yeah, so really nicely printed illustrations by Ted Naismith, and just really nice printing. And yeah, Silmarillion, of course, is such a grand, epic book of like lore and history, and also, being very much a fantasy work. Very amazing. Then the Children of Húrin. And this is just a regular hardback. It's got some pictures in it. And yeah, this is just, one of the stories from the Silmarillion in a more expanded form. Same thing with these next two, Beren and Luthien. And these were published and edited by Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien. Yeah, I guess these all have some color illustrations in them, don't they? It's been a long time since I've read or looked at a lot of the books on the shelf here. I don't read as much as I used to. So I probably will be discovering some things about these that I forgot as I go. Then The Fall of Gondolin, once more, a story from the Silmarillion, once more. It's got some nice color illustrations in it. It's actually got a lot of illustrations in this one. But yeah, just good solid hardback printing. Unfinished Tales, which is various things. Some overlap with the Silmarillion, some other stuff, but all in Tolkien's mythology, all stuff that he never got around to publishing or finishing up in his lifetime. But yeah, Unfinished Tales, very nice. And I guess I'll pop these out since they're up here. I need to kind of get them out of the way anyway. So this is by Robert Foster, and it's a reference work, I guess you call it. There's a map, nice map in there. But it's the complete guide to Middle-earth, and it just has, it's like a, I don't know what you call it, an index or something like that. It's just got like every name of every little thing that you might want to look up in all of Tolkien's works across his different books. Yeah, it's just like all different names and things. It's just, and it's got the page numbers and a little basic description. So yeah, just a nice reference work. And then I've got, so this is an index. It's a whole book just to be one big index for the History of Middle-earth series, which we'll go into right now. So this is the index for it, and then here's the 12-volume History of Middle-earth, and then these two here are the History of the Hobbit, which is the same thing. The History of Middle-earth, like most of these posthumous Tolkien works, was done by his son Christopher. History of the Hobbit was actually done by this guy, John D. Radcliffe. And these, I don't want this video to take forever, so I'm not going to show each one, I don't think. But yeah, I'll pull the first one out here of the History of Middle-earth. They all have these nice covers. I forget who exactly the artists are. These are HarperCollins. I had to get these off amazon.co.uk. Or co.uk. Because they're the English publications. The ones you get in America, the American Tolkien publisher is Houghton Mifflin, and the British, or whatever, UK Tolkien publisher is HarperCollins. But I wanted these editions because they look nice. It looks nice all on the shelf together like that, and they've got the nice covers. But yeah, what it is, the History of Middle-earth and the History of the Hobbit, is it's a textual history for Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings, pretty much all Tolkien's writings within his universe. It's the textual history, so you get all these old versions, early manuscripts, and you see, because he worked on this mythos, or whatever you call it, his whole life, and so it spans years of him slowly developing and changing the stories, and you can see how it came to the final forms that we have in these, published books. So I'll just put these back up here. So now I'll move on down to the second shelf, and we're still on Tolkien. So I have some nice big ones here, which have more artwork in them. Let's see if I can get them out. So this is a nice book. I think it was a bit expensive. It's a little bit hard to find. It's Tolkien, artist and illustrator. He was mainly an author, but he did some illustration as well. Let's see if I can hold this for the camera. I won't be able to show everything, of course, but it's just got a lot of nice artwork that he did. I think most of it is connected with the books, but some aren't. See, that reminds me of Van Gogh, actually. It's just a nice, nature painting there. I haven't looked at this in a long time, once again, like I said, so actually look like there's a lot of local scenes he painted or drew, I guess. That's really cool. Wow, I forgot about all this. And some of it like that's probably Mount Doom or something. Yeah, stuff for The Hobbit. And there's lots of commentary text there you can see. So yeah, a lot of really cool illustrations. I'll have to look at this again. I haven't looked at this in a long time. But that's Tolkien, artist and illustrator. Then I have two versions of the Father Christmas letters. This is a newer version. I think this was also a gift. I think I got it for Christmas, fittingly enough. And so it's titled Letters from Father Christmas. And these were letters that Tolkien wrote to his children. He would actually pretend to be Santa Claus and had this whole elaborate ruse where they thought Santa Claus was coming and leaving them letters and leaving them presents and everything. And so he would write these letters to his children every Christmas, and this was in the 1920s, 1930s. And so there's lots of nice illustrations along with the text. You can see some of the handwritten, it shows like the handwritten letter, and then it shows the printed text there. Really cool. He was a pretty good drawer, especially with landscapes. And so that's a newer printing. This is the actual first edition, and so it's titled The Father Christmas Letters instead of Letters from Father Christmas. This is from 1977. It was published after his death. And this one's a lot thinner. I forget what exactly the difference is in the format, over the way it's laid out. This one is actually like a thinner one, so maybe it doesn't have as many of the pictures and things in it. I'm not sure. That's what this one looks like. Also very nice. So yeah, Tolkien, he wrote grand, serious, mythological kind of works, but he also wrote children's stories, which we have more of. Now, Mr. Bliss. This is also like a picture book that he wrote for his children. It's just a little children's story, and it's got all these nice little pictures with it. It's really creaking, isn't it? Yeah, there's Mr. Bliss, and I think how he actually wrote it was like this. Yeah, and it's got the transcription there, so that's like the original way of it being presented, but then they, edited it to have this kind of vertical readable version as well. So it's got both those in there. It's, half and half or whatever. Then I have these 4 cute little volumes of just various shorter works of his. What's this one? Rover Random, another little children's story. Once again, this one doesn't have so much artwork in it. It's mostly just text. But it's just got these couple little pictures in it. And like I say, I've only read these little children's stories of his once, so I don't remember them very well. This is Farmer Giles of Ham. It's got an illustration there, but once again, it's mostly text. It looks like it's got some little black and white things in it. Then The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. This is actually poetry, and of course Tom Bombadil is in The Lord of the Rings. So some of this ties in with Lord of the Rings, but not all of it. It's just a lot of various poetry, kind of fairy tale type stuff. And then Smith of Wootton Major, which is one of the last things he wrote and published, I think. And it's a bit more serious story, maybe not so much of a children's story. Once again, it's been a while. I kind of forget exactly what it all is about. It's about some Smith living in a little town, but yeah. Then I have this very short story that he wrote, Leaf by Niggle, which this one's very interesting. It's about a guy who's painting, and then by the end he actually physically enters his painting, if I remember correctly. And it's a short story, but it's very interesting. It's got this, purgatorial kind of theme to it. Very interesting. Then the story of Kalervo, and this is a story Tolkien wrote based on an old medieval Finnish legend. I think he basically took the original story from Finnish and then he kind of adapted it, expanded it into his own thing. And yeah, all these books have like commentary in them as well, because these were all published after his death. So then, speaking of ancient stories, I've got Beowulf here. This is Tolkien's translation, but more of it is actually his commentary, because Beowulf isn't a very long work. So technically Beowulf should be down in my nonfiction section. I do have another translation of it, but I just wanted to keep all the Tolkien stuff together. And like I say, this is more commentary. The work itself is quite short, and there's just all this commentary he wrote on it. But yeah, Beowulf is... what is it? It's an epic poem, is technically what it is, and that was Tolkien's field of expertise, and so of course he did a translation, and Old English was the language that he specialized in and was most interested in, so of course he did a Beowulf. Then, now we move into kind of the non-fiction Tolkien, you could say. Some other little things of his, The Monsters and the Critics, and other essays, because of course he was an academic, so this is some of his academic work. Some of this is about Beowulf, some of it's about other things, different essays that he wrote. Then we have the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, and this isn't his complete letters, but it's, a selection. I don't know what proportion of his total letters that they had access to. This was edited by Humphrey Carpenter with the assistance of Christopher Tolkien. And yeah, you get, all his thoughts on things throughout here. A little bit of his biography, comes through in here. A lot of these were written during World War II, and then in the years after, in his later years. So yeah, pretty interesting. I read through all these, and yeah, get a look into his mind. Then we have J.R.R. Tolkien, a biography, also by Humphrey Carpenter. And so this is not written by Tolkien, but it's written about Tolkien, so I have it in the Tolkien category. And yeah, it's just a nice biography. I think only one other biography has been written about him as far as I know. But this was the original one, and it's probably the one that most people have read. I don't know if it's perfect, but, it gives you, it's not too detailed, it gives you a good overview of his life. So it's quite nice. And then lastly, in the Tolkien category, we have this book, The Philosophy of Tolkien, written by Peter Kraft. And I don't generally like reading, an author's commentary on another author. But this one was interesting. It's similar to kind of what you get from his biography and letters. It just sort of gives Tolkien's worldview, views on things, and where he came from and how that informs his writing. Peter Kraft is a Catholic theologian and philosopher, I believe. So yeah, it was an interesting read. So now we're done with the Tolkien category. Now we move into the fiction category, which, like I say, is more specifically modern novels, and it's roughly chronologically ordered. So we have first Herman Melville, Moby Dick, and this is one of the more recent books I read. I read it in 2023, 2024. It's quite a long book, and I read pretty slowly, especially these days, so it took me quite a few months to get through it. Yeah, just a nice hardcover of Moby Dick. Really cool story. It's got this very kind of high-flown, and it's kind of like philosophical and everything, and poetic sort of literary style. And it's like older books tended to be. It's very detailed. You have to be patient, to read through the whole thing. But yeah, it's a very cool adventure story at sea, I don't know if I've read any other books that are specifically like a sea voyage type of story, but those are really cool. So yeah, obviously that's a classic there, and that was published, I think, 1851. So we're in the 19th century for the first books here. Now we have Alice in Wonderland, and it has some other things in here as well. This, as you can see, is a very old copy. I'm not sure how old it is. Let me see if I can look it up here. I think it's mid-20th century. Yeah, I can't really find a specific date in here. But this is special. I don't have a lot of old copies of books. I generally just, get a newer, cheaper one. But this one I got the one time in my life that I got to visit England, which I guess is, like my one trip to Europe, other than Germany when I was a little kid, which I don't remember too well. Went to England in 2019 when I was 22, and was in Oxford, and I wanted to get some kind of souvenir from my trip, and I found this. I believe it was the Blackwell's bookshop in Oxford, England. And yeah, so I saw this in there, and I'm like, oh, this is a good one. I may have read like an abridged it's already a children's book, but like maybe a simplified abridged version or something like that of Alice in Wonderland when I was a little kid. I don't know if I ever saw the movie. I haven't seen many of the Disney movies, but in any case, I sort of knew what the story was, but I wanted to read it again or go through it again, and so yeah. Anyway, this has Alice in Wonderland in it, and then it's got Through the Looking Glass, which is the sequel to that. So it's got those two by Lewis Carroll, but then it's got this other story. What is it? The Rose in the Ring by W.M. Thackeray. So it's just another popular fictional kind of children's story from the 19th century, from that Victorian era. And I guess they wanted to make the book a little thicker, so they put another classic story in there by another author. And I didn't enjoy it as much, but I don't know. It was interesting. It was entertaining. So then we have Heidi. This is also one of the ones I only more recently read in 2024. I feel like Heidi is another one that I may have read like a version of it in school when I was a little kid, but it'd been so many years I didn't really remember it, and I wanted to read it again. So I got this nice hardcover. This looks like also kind of an older printing. But yeah, a nice hardcover of Heidi. It's got these little illustrations in it. So yeah, I do like, reading some children's stories as well. A good children's story is good for adults as well, Then I've got the Jungle Books. And these I haven't actually read in these editions here. I had just a basic one-volume paperback. But I like to have a lot of books in hardback. And then what I liked about these, I found, is these are organized differently. The original Jungle Book, there's a Jungle Book and the second Jungle Book, which were published both in the 1890s, I believe. I should be saying the authors' names. This is Rudyard Kipling. Heidi is by Johannes Spyri, however you pronounce that. But anyway, Jungle Books, these are backwards. The way it's published, they're collections of short stories, both volumes of the Jungle Book, and some of the stories center around the characters of Mowgli and Baloo and Bagheera and all those famous characters, but some are completely independent from them, just other, anthropomorphic animals or whatever you call it. But what this does is so it's the Jungle Books, Volume 1, Volume 2. It takes all the Mowgli-related stories and puts them in Volume 1, and then all the unrelated ones in Volume 2. which I think would be a nice way of reading through it, right? You get to read all the Mowgli stories together. And so I do eventually want to read this again, read it in this version. It's another older printing. It's pretty cool. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but everything that's on this shelf is pretty much all the books I've ever read. There's a few books I've gotten rid of over the years that I just am not interested in anymore. Some of the ones I read as a teenager, I read a little bit of science fiction and things that I don't really care for anymore. But yeah, most of what's on this shelf, like this is pretty much everything that I've ever read, except I do also read a lot of stuff that isn't in physical books. I read a lot of Wikipedia, just Wikipedia articles about all kinds of things. I know it's not the most reliable source of information, but yeah, it's a good way to just get overviews of things. I'm a big picture guy. I like to get like an overview of a topic of whatever it is. So yeah, I read a lot of books, or in the past have read a lot of books, but I also read probably just as much stuff from Wikipedia. All right, so continuing through our nonfiction, now we have, I think this was right at the end of the 18th century, it might have been 1900 or something like that. This is one of the few science fiction works I have. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Of course, it's an old classic of science fiction. I don't know if this is any fancy printing. I think this is a pretty basic, really small text, harder to read. But yeah, Time Machine, quite interesting. Kind of speculative future fiction, whatever you want to call that. Then we have C.S. Lewis, The Chronicles of Narnia. So now we're back in the fantasy category. And so I have these paperbacks of The Chronicles of Narnia. Pretty nicely printed. Nice readable text, and they got some illustrations in them, like these little guys. I don't like Chronicles of Narnia. I'm not as much of a Lewis fan as I am a Tolkien fan. They're a bit more, well, it's not as immersive and like consistent and well crafted of a world as what Tolkien created, and the tone is a bit more children's story. Tolkien stuff gets a bit more grand. I guess Narnia does as well. I only ever read through the whole Narnia series once, so I don't remember it super well. Most of what's on my bookshelf I've only ever read once. It's really the Tolkien stuff, like Lord of the Rings and Hobbit and Silmarillion in particular, that I've read through a lot of times. But yeah, I'll just show the covers of all these. But yeah, of course Narnia is nonetheless very good. You know, I love fantasy. If I could only read one genre of literature, I would have to stick with fantasy. And then the last one right here. Alright, and so those were, I guess chronologically here, that was like 1940s, I think those were all published. Now we get a little bit later on, Cloud Atlas. I forget the exact year, but it's early 2000s. Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. I don't know what genre you describe this as. It's like kind of science fiction, parts of it, but then parts of it are in historical times. It covers a broad range of times. Yeah, just a really interesting novel. The way it like combines these different characters from different time periods into one story, and I think it's all supposed to be one person who's been reincarnated at different points in history in different parts of the world. Then I have this novel, The Quick, by Lauren Owen. I don't think it's a very famous book, or that Lauren Owen is a very well-known author. But see this cover? See how cool that looks? This really cool Victorian-looking photograph. I don't know if it's an actual historical photograph or not. I'm thinking not. I think it's just meant to look like that. But I was in the bookstore one day, and this is when this was just released. It was in 2014. I was 17 years old. And yeah, I just went to the bookstore randomly to kind of look around, and they had this on display because it was a new release. And I thought, wow, that looks so cool. And I've never been hugely into like Victorian or Gothic things or anything like that, but I think I knew a little bit about it just from Tolkien. I mean, his literature isn't in that category, but he was born in 1892, and he kind of came from that late Victorian generation. So anyway, I think I had some interest in it, but yeah, that just looked so fascinating to me. And if you haven't noticed already, I like to read older things, or at least things that are set in an older time period. And so yeah, it's an interesting novel. It's a vampire novel. It's a pretty complex, long novel through the eyes of several characters. Um, so yeah, pretty interesting read. I read it twice. Second time was a few years later. And you can see even this, like it's got this uneven. I don't know if you can see that, like lengths of pages, which I guess is how older books would have been. They wouldn't have been so cleanly cut off. Um, so yeah, this is just a nice physical copy, and this is one of the few where I've kept the dust jacket because that's what attracted me to it in the first place. So yeah, The Quick by Lauren Owen. And so now we're going to have to move the camera down so we can get down to the lower shelves, and we'll continue through the fiction category. Alright, so now down here, I'm crouched on the ground, so my head will probably be popping out of frame like this most of the time. But anyway, continuing with the fiction. So now we get to Aragon. And like I say, this is where I started with being a serious reader. This was the first book that I really enjoyed and was really memorable. And this is the actual copy that I had then. And it's really worn out because I didn't used to take care of my books. You can see my mom at some point taped it along the spine and along the edges here to keep it from falling apart entirely. But yeah, this is, I don't know when this was printed exactly, but I first read it in 2008. My brother was more of a reader than me. He read the series, or he read this book first, and then he suggested it to me, and so it's got this little promotional thing. Book 3, Brissinger on sale, September 20th, 2008. That was the third book, which was, upcoming out of the total 4. So yeah, it's a cool little historical relic there. Yep, I read this when I was 11 years old in 2008, and this was my introduction to fantasy. This book is probably, this series by Christopher Paolini is probably not the most original. It, copies a lot of things, kind of standard things that you see in a lot of other fantasy works. But it is very well written. It's, young adult fiction, or even like, I don't know what the demographic is, teenagers, young adults, something like that. But yeah, I really got into these books. They were just, it's a story that I could really get immersed into this world that Paolini created. And it's, it's a very adventurous, fairly action-packed, but a lot of lore as well. So yeah, I've got this original paperback. So yeah, continuing with the Inheritance cycle. So I have them all in nice hardcover editions now as well. This one is also very old. I had a mix of paperbacks and hardcovers when I first read it. Aragon and Eldest I had both in paperback, and then I had Brissinger hardcover, and then when Inheritance came out in 2011, my brother read it as well. We got it in hardcover. So Brissinger, I think the dust jacket got so destroyed or it got lost or something, so this doesn't have its dust jacket, so we don't get to see the nice picture of the dragon. And this one's also been taped. But yeah, I don't know why I'm going out of order here, but I just wanted to show that. I like these hardcover ones better. The printing's bigger, and they're not too heavyweight, so they're not too uncomfortable to hold in your hand. But yeah, I read through the Inheritance cycle probably about 3 times total throughout my pre-teens and teen years. There's a nice picture there. And yeah, at some point I got the hardcovers of these just because I wanted it all to be consistent. I like my books to look nice on the shelf, and I just like hardbacks better than paperbacks. There's those, and then Inheritance. Final one in the cycle, I think it's called, Inheritance cycle. Then, of course, there's a few more works by Christopher Paolini in the same world. I think he has... So this is Murtagh. This came out 2023. The cover doesn't look nearly as good as the original series. It looks kind of funky to me. I don't know. But Murtagh, it's... I guess this comes after the time, shortly after the time of Inheritance. And yeah, I know I've seen on his website he's got a second Murtagh book. I don't know what the title is going to be, but he's going to release a second one soon, so that'll be cool. I'll read that. And so yeah, I like Murtagh, but what I realized about Christopher Paolini reading this is that the books are written in third person, but they do kind of get in the head of the characters, and I realized that all of his characters, whether it's Aragon or Murtagh or some of the other characters that you get their perspectives of in the series, all kind of think the same way,
which I'm sure that's the way that Paolini himself thinks. So his characters will naturally think kind of like he does, and there's some difference in personality, but I find them all to be kind of the same. Is the only thing about his characters. They all kind of have this strong sense of like duty and justice, and I don't know, just this certain like personality and way of thinking. um, but it's still good, entertaining reads. He's still a good writer, so I still keep reading anything he publishes in this world. And then he also put this out. I think it's like a collection of shorter stories within the world of Allegasia. And yeah, I read this when it came out, but I haven't read it since, so I kind of forget a lot of it, but yeah. So now next I have Suzanne Collins, the Hunger Games series. I read these as a teenager. One of the few sci-fi works I've read. I guess, I don't know, these are dystopia sci-fi. I'm not sure exactly what the genre is. But yeah, obviously this is a very popular series. So I've just got these nice hardcovers of all of them. Saw the movie when it came out in 2012 when I was 15 years old, and then shortly thereafter got the books and started reading through. And it was just the trilogy at the time. I think 2020 this one came out, and then 2025 this newest one came out. I don't know, with Hunger Games, the first book was the best, the same way that the first movie is the best. Just that core idea is so good, and like being immersed in it for the first time. Obviously the series goes beyond, it goes into different things, but it does get a little old after a while, that universe that she's created. I don't know, I find that I'm not very interested in it anymore like I was when I first read, but yeah, it's like one of those series like with Paolini or with Collins, just because I've read everything so far, I feel obligated, like I have to keep reading each new one that comes out to get more of the story or whatever. And so now we move on into the nonfiction. And like I say, I count ancient works of mythology and epic poetry as nonfiction. And like with everything in the shelf, it's roughly chronologically ordered. Not exactly. But I start here with Homer, of course, the most classic of classics. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And this is a really nice looking version. Nice printing. It's even got this gold here. And this is the translation by Sam Butler. I always try to look up on the internet what good translations are. I'm a fan of a translation that sticks close to the original, but is also readable in, current English, not some weird high-flown writing style. So yeah, I think I've read this twice, Iliad and Odyssey. And pretty much everything on the shelf from this point onward is going to be stuff that I read in my early 20s. Like I say, as a teenager, I pretty much just read fiction novels, like all the stuff that we've already looked at. But then I started getting into mythology and just various nonfiction. You'll see as we go what stuff I've gotten there. But yeah, got my Iliad and Odyssey. There's no illustrations, or no proper ones anyhow, but it's just a nice printing. Yeah, I love reading ancient works or medieval works because people just wrote so differently back then, it's just you get things that seem weird to us as modern readers. So that's why you'll see I have quite a bit of old literature in here, like very old. Oh yeah, and this is a prose translation. I always, even if it's originally a poetic work, this is a epic poem. I always like to read things in prose if I can. I just don't get poetry. I've never been interested in poetry. I love music, and the lyrics to music, but when there's no music, I just reading lines like that, I don't know, it just doesn't do anything for me. So I either like to be on the music side or on the prose side. Poetry for me is kind of in this weird place in between that I don't really get. I don't know, I've never enjoyed it. So you'll see a lot of these works here are poetry, epic poems, and things like that I have in prose translation. I think they're pretty much all in prose form. So here's another ancient Greek poem. This is a shorter work. It's Hesiod, Works and Days, and Theogony. So it looks like this one is in poetic form. But yeah, I don't read poetry for the poetry. I read these books for the content, for that look into the ancient world, that immersion. I'm all about immersing myself in whether it's a fictional world or into the ancient world. And this is the one book where I stole some of the lyrics from it, or adapted some of the lyrics from it into my song Works and Days on my album Brundeveld. Yeah, I don't know what inspired me. I didn't have a lot of lyrical ideas for what I wanted to sing about in that album, but I've always liked the ancient themes, and yeah, no, this work came to mind. It seemed like it would be fitting for the song, and so I just, yeah, took some lyrics out of here and kind of modified them to my own version for my song. So then moving on through classics, so that was my two Greek works that I have. Like I say, we're going roughly chronologically here, but also I'm kind of grouping them by language or part of the world or whatever. So now we get into, this is a Latin Roman work, Virgil, also an epic poem. And yeah, this is a prose translation, translated by David West. And yeah, this is just a mythological account of how Rome was founded. And then another Roman Latin author, I have Tacitus or Tacitus, Germania. This is interesting because it's the Roman perspective on the ancient Germanic peoples. And this is the earliest literature we have, or earliest records we have of Germanic peoples. It's from a Roman perspective, so it may not be fully accurate. And Tacitus himself never visited them, so I think he's basing this on other people's writings who actually visited the Germanic people. But yeah, that's a very interesting one there. Get that look into, Europe kind of before it was civilized, or more northern Europe before it was civilized. Or maybe it was civilized, but not in the way, that it would later become. So now we go back in time. This is actually the oldest literature, some of the oldest literature in the world. Certainly the oldest thing I have on my shelf. And this is from Mesopotamia, those earliest civilizations, the Enuma Elish, which is a creation myth. It's a very thin little book. You can see it's not a very long piece of writing. But yeah, this is just the ancient Mesopotamian, translated by L.W. King, ancient Mesopotamian, creation myth, I guess you call it. So moving on, staying in the Middle East, I guess. Now we have the Bible. I grew up very familiar with the Bible. I grew up Protestant, but this is a Catholic Bible because in my early 20s I got interested in Catholicism because Tolkien was a Catholic and I read his biography and his letters and everything. So I thought, man, I should get the Catholic Bible because it has all these extra books in it, the deuterocanonical works, as Catholics call them, and I think apocryphal works is what Protestants call them. But anyway, it has other books in it that aren't in your Protestant Bible. And yeah, it's just a pretty nice standard Bible printing, thin pages, and this is the NRSV. And I was exposed to the Bible a lot growing up, but then I did actually do a dedicated read through of the whole Bible when I was 18, and I listened to it on audiobook as well. So I think I've gone through the entire Bible from front to back twice, once in physical copy, once in audiobook. But funnily enough, I never have actually read the deuterocanonical works because I got this a little bit after that, and then I don't know, I just wasn't actually interested enough to read them. So I've only ever read the Protestant Bible, but I have a Catholic one here. But on a similar note, now we have early Christian writings, and this is writings that came, I don't know, 100 years or 200 years or so after the New Testament writings. And they're quite similar in genre. I forget exactly, but I think some of these are epistles, letters, and I think there's a gospel or two in there. But yeah, just, early Christians kind of immediately after the time of the very earliest Christians who wrote the New Testament. So that's a pretty interesting read, because it's kind of like reading the Bible, but like stuff that you've never heard, in a church setting. So next we have the Hermetica, and this was written, I think, by multiple authors. I think it's attributed to a legendary author, but I think it was written by multiple people, kind of compiled over several centuries, late centuries BCE, early centuries CE. But yeah, it's just a collection of writings in the Hermetic tradition, which is a philosophical, religious sort of thing that was going on in the, I don't know exactly what part of the world, I guess sort of Roman Empire. And yeah, this book was very kind of hard to understand. I don't remember much of what I read in it. But I was interested in this because I guess the Hermetic tradition, it's related to Gnosticism, or Gnosticism grew out of it, and alchemy. I think this is kind of the foundation of where alchemy comes from. I forget how those things are all interrelated, but I was interested in that sort of, non-mainstream side of Western thought. So yeah, I don't remember a lot of it, but I was interested in that sort of thing, Hermeticism and Gnosticism and alchemy and all that, so I read this one book. Okay, now we move sort of out of the classical era, and we move into more northern Europe, so kind of geographically and time-wise. Now this is Beowulf, so this is the oldest piece of literature in the English language, in Old English, and this is translated by David Wright. Like I already showed before, I have the Tolkien translation, which was less readable. It was in I don't know what you call it, a grander style. This one's a bit more straightforward, modern English style, which, like I say, I prefer that for translations. And this is an old copy, too. And it's an old paperback. Oh, I have a note in there. Sometimes I use these as bookmarks, but I also take notes on these. So yeah, it's another ancient epic poem, but now in the English language from a more northern part of Europe. Now moving on with medieval literature, we have the Poetic Edda. This is Old Norse poetry, and this is the translation by Jackson Crawford, the YouTuber Jackson Crawford. I think I kind of got into this stuff. I was already interested in that kind of thing from Tolkien, but then I think watching Crawford's channel got me more interested in it, so I got his translation of the Poetic Edda, and this is actually translated as poetry, isn't it? And then I don't know if Crawford has done the prose Edda yet. I know he's at least planning it. Maybe he's already published it. Don't follow him as much as I used to, but at the time he hadn't done the prose Edda yet, so I have a different translation of the prose Edda by Jesse Al Biok, I think is how you pronounce that. And actually there's some poetry in there, isn't it? But it's mainly prose. Obviously it's called the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. This is actually written by a medieval author we have the name of. And then finishing off our ancient literature, we have the Mabinogion, I think is how you pronounce it. And this is an Irish, I think it's Irish, or it's Celtic at least, collection of tales from the British Isles. It's just various stories, and yeah, pretty interesting, I don't have a particular interest in like the Celtic world or anything, but I just, anything from ancient and medieval Europe, I like it in general, so this was a good one. And the translation is by Gwyn Jones and Thomas Jones. Okay, now I'm sitting on the floor because we're getting so low down in the shelf here. So next we have this nice book. It is the illustrated A to Z of classic mythology. So this is a nice companion piece to some of the other books I have. But yeah, it's lots of nice illustrations, but it's organized with the, all the names of any name you would want to know. Starting with A, and it's just got information, your basics about every character and every thing, or I don't know if I should say character, but every figure. And it's organized by classical mythology, Celtic mythology, and Norse mythology, I think are the three categories. Yeah, and finally there's Norse mythology. Yeah, just all kinds of nice illustrations, and just, like nice little basic information about anything that you encounter, especially all the different heroes and monsters and whatnot. So I haven't read through this whole thing. I got it more for the pictures than anything. But yeah, it's a nice reference work if I ever wanted to look any information up about any of this stuff. And so now, this is one of my very few art books. This is a big, heavy thing, which I'm going to struggle to hold up here, of Van Gogh. I know that's not the proper way to pronounce his name, but that's my stupid American pronunciation. But this is just, what is it called? The Complete Paintings. And yeah, it just has a lot of his paintings in it. I'm not going to show too much because this is so heavy. Some are printed really big like this. Some smaller. But yeah, it just has, I don't know if it's all of his paintings, but it's just a very large collection of his paintings in here. And it's got all this text as well, which I haven't read. Once again, I got this more for the pictures. But yeah, you can read through it, and it's just all kinds of commentary on, the different his history as an artist, his development as an artist, and the background of everything. I've read a little bit of it here and there, but yeah. So it's a very detailed book all about Van Gogh's art. And I'm not big into I'm not a big art connoisseur or painting connoisseur, but I really do like Vincent van Gogh. Of course, because of the style being so interesting and unique, but also just his focus on nature and the countryside and peasant life and things like that. Those rural things. I'm a big fan of that. So yeah, that's a big attraction to his stuff for me. And also just his life story, is like half of what's so fascinating about the whole thing. His failure to gain any recognition and his poverty and all that is very, very fascinating life story. And he was a very smart guy, very talented guy. And of course he has red hair like me, so there's some physical resemblance there. Oh yeah, and that was compiled or written by Ingo F. Walther and Rainer Metzger. And then the one other art book I have, this is the artwork of Arthur Rackham, Masterpieces of Art. He's just the artist from the, I think, late 19th, maybe more like early 20th century, who did a lot of fairy story illustration and just had a really cool, unique style. I think he would use combination of pencil and pen and paint and different things, within each artwork, which is part of what gives it everything its unique look. Yeah, all sorts of artwork in here. Very nice to look through. Not a whole lot of commentary in this one. This one's, yeah, it's just really the artworks themselves and little description of each one. But yeah, one of the few artists that I liked his style enough to actually get a book of his work. And that was put together by Joseph Simas, something like that. And then speaking of Arthur Rackham, what I have here is Grimm's Fairy Tales. Really nice looking exterior on this, nice design. But this has a lot of illustrations by Arthur Rackham as well, throughout. Some little ones like that, some full color ones. But yeah, this is just your Grimm's Fairy Tales. Everyone knows about it. I have it down here in nonfiction instead of up in my fiction category because I kind of counted it also as, along with the mythology and the epics and things like that. It's an old oral tradition of stories that, yeah, I guess they're fictional, but I put it with the historical stuff, so to speak. This was compiled by the Brothers Grimm in the early 19th century. But the stories go back a lot further than that, so that's why I have it here with all the other ancient works. And this is the Margaret Hunt translation. So now we finally move out of the mythical sort of world into other types of nonfiction, and chronologically we're moving along here as well to more modern times. And this is all going to be pretty chronological, so we have starting here Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, also known as his first essay. This is a philosophical work, and it began his career, his fame as a philosopher. I don't read a lot of philosophy, but there's a few that I'm interested in. And so the essay itself is quite short. It's just an essay. It's not a full book. So it only takes up, I don't know what, a pretty small amount, maybe about that much. And the rest of it is all various replies or criticisms that his contemporaries gave of all the things they didn't like about his essay, because it was, going against the grain of what everyone was thinking at the time, I think. But yeah, I just got interested in Jean-Jacques Rousseau first from his Confessions, which I don't have in a physical copy. That'll be in the audiobook section of the video. But I've listened to the audiobook twice. And yeah, so I read about his life and his autobiography, and then I was interested in some of his philosophy. And so, yeah, this is translated by Judith R. Bush and Roger D. Masters. Next we have, this is actually two books in one. It's not printed very nicely. It's The Black Death and the Dancing Mania by Justus Friedrich Karl Hecker. Probably didn't pronounce that very well, German name, but yeah, so this is historical. It's like a history book, or a medical history, I guess you'd call it. I think he was a doctor. And it's all about the Black Death and this other medieval phenomenon, very interesting, known as the Dancing Mania, in which hordes of people would all start dancing together. They kind of went crazy. It's very interesting. So it's kind of a psychological look at that, I guess. And this is a fairly old book. It's from, I'll put the date on screen maybe, but it's early 1800s, I think. So now moving on through the 19th century, another scientific sort of work. Well, this is a work of science, On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, obviously a very famous classic book in biology. And this particular edition, I think, is it's like the first edition, how it would have originally been printed. It's a nice modern printing, but it's the text of the original edition, because later on he made revisions as he did more research and whatever. But I'm not so much there for the, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not looking for like the most scientifically accurate version. I just, thought it'd be interesting to read the book as it was first read by people at that time, the first proper book on evolutionary theory. And yeah, I find animals, zoology and biology really interesting. So I have a few books of those you'll see later on. But yeah, I had to get that one. I find the evolutionary stuff very interesting. Next we have, I think this was published in 1900, Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum. He was Canadian-American, I believe, and he was a sailor who, he sailed around the world in a pretty small boat. And yeah, so this is just, like a travel book, or whatever you call it, It's a memoir of his long travel around the world. I think maybe he was the first person to solo navigate around the entire world. I think that's what it might have been, or to circumnavigate the globe by himself. Anyway, pretty cool story about his sea journey. Next, so we're in the late 1800s here. We have Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's the only thing I've read of his. I'm not super big into philosophy, but I'd heard that this book was not exactly a philosophy textbook. It's much more, it's like I don't know how to describe it. It's got a lot of imagery and weird, I really don't know how to describe it, and that's kind of what I like about it. I haven't actually read this physical copy. I listened to it on an audiobook, but I do want to get around to reading the physical copy at some point. But yeah, this is a very interesting book. I don't really understand what he's saying most of the time, but it's got a lot of interesting imagery to it, and it's just, that's what I like about it. I kind of like something that I don't necessarily understand it, but it nonetheless gives a very strong impression, So yeah, I listened to this on audiobook, and I'll have to read through this, but yeah, very, very interesting book. And this is the translation by R.J. Hollingdale. Next, another philosophy book, and this really is a dense, hard to read, technical philosophy book. The only one I really have like that. It's Charles Sanders Peirce, Volume 2 of his selected philosophical writings. And I haven't read this whole thing, but I was interested in pragmatism. And so this has a lot of, all his main writings on the philosophy of pragmatism, which he invented, are in here. So I don't know what proportion of the book it is, maybe a third or half of it. I just read through the parts that were about pragmatism, but he wrote about other things as well. He was a logician and mathematician, I think, first. And then he also expanded more into philosophy. But yeah, it's quite technical. I don't understand most of it, but there were some, tidbits throughout there that I could grasp that I found pretty interesting. And then we have one more book on pragmatism, this one written by William James, another American philosopher, and he was one of the early psychologists too, I believe. And this is much more readable and easy to understand, and it's a much shorter book, so this is, really, if you want to read about pragmatism, this is the better book to get, unless you want to get really technical. Yeah, Pragmatism, A New Name for Some Old Ways of Thinking, that's what it's called, by William James. So now we're moving into the 20th century, and now we get to the most interesting book I've ever read. It's not my favorite book, The Lord of the Rings is my favorite, but this book it's something else. It's a book like none other. The Red Book by Carl Jung. It's not something that he published in his lifetime, or that he intended for publication, but his estate or whatever decided to publish it after his death. It was written starting in 1913, I think, into the 1920s, over the course of maybe a decade. And of course, Carl Jung is a very famous psychologist. But this book, like Zarathustra by Nietzsche, it's not like a textbook on psychology. It's not, super formal in the way it's written. It's what it is it's a book of these visions or imaginations that Jung underwent, which he then, wrote commentary on. And it was this turning point in his life and his career. And yeah, it's really hard to explain, but it's got a lot of very interesting, like, visual imagery as well as ideas. It kind of gets into the unconscious mind of Europe, so to speak, but like the unconscious mind behind Christianity and behind all this philosophy that's developed in the Western world. It's like this weird look at like what goes on in the collective unconscious, kind of what's behind everything that we see on the surface in Western philosophy and religion and whatnot. So very, very interesting book. I read it twice in physical copy, and then once I listened through it in the audiobook. But yeah, most interesting book ever. I really can't describe it, but it's just a book of visions and then commentary on those visions. And it's just very interesting psychologically. And, he was from Switzerland and had studied classical literature and, like books like these mythology books and things that I have up here. And so if you're interested in that world too, it's interesting, him coming from that kind of perspective, being knowledgeable about, those ancient European things. And this is the only version of it that exists. Maybe there's different, printed versions, but this is the only one publication, is the translation and editing and everything by Soni Shamdasani. I think there were actually other translators involved as well. Yeah, so he was one of the translators, but also Mark Kiberts and John Peck. Anyway, if you want to get this book, that's the version that exists. So now another psychologist, Sigmund Freud. Of course, he's even more famous than Jung. Everyone knows about Freud. This is the one book of his that I have, and this is one of his last books, maybe the last book he ever wrote and published. I think it was around 1930, or 1930 something. And it's not so much a psychology book, because it's a later work of his. He was getting into more philosophical territory. And yeah, it's all about his views on civilization and, where it comes from psychologically, and just the whole interplay between the human psyche and the civilized world, something like that. I have such a bad memory, but yeah. So now we move, continuing with philosophy, but getting a little bit more into theology as well. We have several more books by C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, but he also was a lay theologian and philosopher. And so I've got a few of his works. This is a very old printing. I don't know how old it is. This may be a first edition from the 1940s. I think all these Lewis books I have here were from roughly the 1940s or 50s maybe. But yeah, look at this old yellow pages. Not the yellow pages, but you know what I mean. It's even got some old library thing there. And yeah, this is The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. It's about the philosophical problem of evil. If God exists, why is there evil? That kind of thing. We've got Miracles by C.S. Lewis. And these are, like I say, theological / philosophical writings. And sorry, the lighting just got really dark, but we're going to plow on here. So yeah, a book about miracles. And then Mere Christianity. I think this has various topics in it. It was originally talks that he did over the radio to people serving in the Second World War. And then it was put into book form. This is probably his most famous theological, philosophical work, Mere Christianity. Next I have The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. Another sort of philosophical book, and this is another old printing. I think this book was also published in the 40s. I don't know if this copy is from the 40s, but got that nice old vibe to it and that old smell. Perennial Philosophy. I don't remember much about this one, but I remember becoming interested in perennialism, which is what this book's about. And yeah, Aldous Huxley, English author, wrote a book about it. Now we get into my sort of World War One, World War Two category here. And apologies for the light getting darker again. But we have, this is The Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger, who was a soldier in the First World War, and this is his memoir of his experience in the war. He's a German soldier. For a while I became quite interested in the mainly World War II and the whole Nazi movement, and sort of the psychology behind that. But then even World War I, of course, is what led to World War II and that whole thing. So I found this interesting, the perspective of a German serving in the First World War. And this is translated by Basil Creighton. Next I have Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. Like I say, I was interested in the Nazi movement and why it happened and everything. Became really interested in that, and so I wanted to read what Hitler had to say in his book. It's organized into two parts. I only read the first part, I only got halfway through it, because it's just so long and rambling, and he just goes on and on about this political thing and this racial thing, and it's not a very well written book. But I read through the first half, which was probably the more interesting half anyway, because I think the first half he's going more over his his background, a little bit of his autobiography, but more his background of his political and racial thought and everything. And this second half, I think, was more about his plans for the Great Reich that was to come. And this Mein Kampf translation, I think, is the first one that was done in English. It says 1939, translated by James Murphy. And so then one more in this subject matter, I have just a history book, The Storm of War. It's just an overall book about World War II, written by Andrew Roberts. And it's got some pictures in it. But yeah, I just wanted a broad World War II history. I've read a lot more about World War II on Wikipedia, because I like just having a nice overall summary like that. But an actual book by a qualified historian is good as well. Then I have A History of the British Isles by Jeremy Black, one of my few actual history books. It's just like a history textbook, and I found it to be quite dull. It's just all about, this king and this war and, these dates. It's very uninteresting kind of history reading. I always wish that there were more history books. Maybe I just haven't discovered them, but books that actually gave you, what was the experience of the everyday person in a given time and place. That's what I'm more interested in. I would like to have more history books that were more immersive, telling you what it was like if you lived as a common person in whatever time period. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of these history books. It's just all about the wars and the kings and political stuff and whatever. But yeah, I've got that one there. Now, another psychology/philosophy book. I have Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson. I've first encountered Jordan Peterson online on YouTube, probably like most people. And that's what first sparked my interest in psychology. I never thought much of psychology before that. But Peterson, listening to some of his lectures, got me interested in psychology. And I just really liked how he would, I don't know, I'm not necessarily a fan of his or a adherent or a follower of his, but I did find it quite interesting, his perspective and how he goes into mythology, and he takes religious and mythological writing seriously and looks at history, and then ties that in with psychology, and the way he brings so many things together, which this book does. This is like, I think it's the first proper book he published, but it's a little bit outdated maybe, but it's his main big book he wrote on that kind of stuff that he lectures about. And Peterson is how I discovered, Carl Jung, and, well, I guess I already knew about Freud, but he talked a bit about Freud, and so that kind of led me to read more of the classical psychologists, especially Jung. I got really interested in. And now just a few more here. I have, what is this? 3 books by Franz de Waal, another author I discovered from reading or from listening to Peterson. And Franz de Waal was a primatologist, and he studied chimpanzees. And so I have these 3 books by Franz de Waal. This one's Chimpanzee Politics. Very interesting book. He did a long observation and study of a group of chimpanzees in a zoo. And this book is all about that, all about their social dynamics. And it's very interesting to see the similarities and differences from chimpanzees to humans. So that's that one. This is another one, Primates and Philosophers. I remember this one being less interesting. It's like some kind of back and forth of like him and criticisms from other scientists or something. I forget what exactly this one is, but yeah, more about chimpanzees. And then this one, a bit more broadly, not just about chimpanzees, about all kinds of different animals. It's all about animal intelligence, and it's called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? So this was a very interesting read. It's just, obviously he has a bit more of a focus on the primates because that's his specialty, but he talks about all their kinds of animals and what we can learn about their intelligence. Very interesting. Like I say, I do like animals, and I read a lot of stuff about animals on Wikipedia, but I've got a few proper books as well in that zoology category, and particularly about chimpanzees. I find chimpanzees and other great apes really fascinating. And then one more kind of animal-related book. This is The Man Who Lives with Wolves by Sean Ellis. And as the title suggests, he actually lived with wolves first in a zoo setting, and then he went and, so he claims, it seems rather fantastical, but the way he recounts it in detail, I'm inclined to believe him. He went and lived for like a year or more in the wild with a pack of wolves, eating meat and everything, becoming part of the pack. It's quite a fascinating read. He was from England, but then he went to America to live with wolves. And then he, I think, later started a rehabilitation sort of center or something like that, where he was, had continued his living with and studying wolves. So it's not exactly a scientific book, but it's, a very interesting read about a man who lived with wolves. And then lastly on this shelf, and this is just a few more books that I'll get to on the very bottom shelf. We're almost done. This is the only book I have in this genre. I don't know if you call it self-help, really, but it's The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, and I wrote How to Find Peace on the front, because that's what I got from it. It's just like a practical guide on, not engaging with your thoughts or not letting your thoughts get control of you, about living in the moment. He has a whole sort of philosophy about time and living in the now, as he calls it. So this was a good read. Like I say, to find peace, I think his big point is to not, think of your thoughts as you, to separate your ego and your sense of self from your intellectual thoughts, which I think is a good idea because, in my experience reading about chimpanzees and evolution and all that, intelligence is a much more recently, human intelligence like we have is a much more recently evolved thing. And our core being, is really not much to do with our intellect. It's those deeper emotional kind of other aspects of human psychology that are a lot more important than your intellectual thoughts. So this book, he doesn't really talk about it in evolutionary terms, but it kind of gets at that same basic thing, I think, which I think is a very good way of looking at it. Intelligence is sort of a very thin layer on top of the much deeper parts of our psychology. Alright, so finally, now I'm way down here at the bottom shelf. Just a few more books to go, mostly language books. So starting here, we have the compact edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. And this is the compact version, which shows you how big the actual Oxford English Dictionary is. I think if you buy the full physical set, it's like 20 volumes or more. So this is condensed into 2 volumes, and what it is, it's the full text of the Oxford English Dictionary, which goes into great detail of every word. I'm not going to pull this out because it's so heavy, I don't really feel like doing it. But it's just, what this is it's printed in a very small font size or typeface, and so it's actually got this drawer here where you're supposed to have a magnifying glass, and you use the magnifying glass to actually be able to read it. So it's like very small printing. You can read it with your naked eye, but it's very small, depending on how good your vision is. But I just found this in a secondhand store, and I thought, oh, that's too cool, I've got to pick that up. Because it's got every word you could possibly think of in the English language, and great detail about the etymology and everything of each word. So then here is just my regular little paperback Oxford English Dictionary. I don't use it much, but I like the idea of having a dictionary in a physical copy. And then here, now we have some dictionaries and things for other languages. I used to have ambitions and aspirations of learning different European languages, which I never did. But I took German in college for a year, and so I got this is a English to German, German to English dictionary. So anytime you need to translate a word one way or the other, you've got all that in here. So I picked that up to help me with my German, which, like I say, I dropped out of it after a year. And then I've got these two books, which are on Icelandic. This is another dictionary. It's English to Icelandic, Icelandic to English dictionary. Icelandic, I think, is the coolest sounding and looking language for me personally. Just the way it's spelled and just the way it's pronounced, it's just it's such a cool language. If I was gonna actually put in the work to learn any language, I'd probably have to do Icelandic. And it's cool because it's descended directly from Old Norse, which, the Old Norse literature is in that I was showing earlier. And then this is an Icelandic dictionary, but it's an actual Icelandic dictionary. There's no English text in here. It's all Icelandic. And yeah, I was just getting nerdy about Icelandic, so I can't, really use this for anything. But yeah, it's just a nice Icelandic dictionary. Don't know what else to say about it. And then here I have the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Like I say, I grew up Protestant, but because of Tolkien, I got interested in Catholicism. But yeah, I did read through the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And like with most things, I don't remember much of it, but I guess I have some Catholic education from that. Now this one, speaking of Catholic books, this is from my grandparents, who are Catholics, I should say. This is it's the Missale Romanum. It's just sort of everything that you need to conduct Mass, I think is what it is. But this is an old book that they had from, I don't know how far back. Actually, it says right there. Look at that. They came from a German-speaking community in the tiny town of Horizon in Saskatchewan, Canada. I don't know if it was exactly a German-speaking community. I think English was the language that everyone used, but a lot of the people came from a German background, so they still had their German language, like my great-grandparents did, but not my grandparents. So anyway, this is from my great-grandparents' generation, so it has this German inscription about the Church of Horizon, the small town of Horizon, some people's names. I'm not sure who these people are. But yeah, 1924. So old 1924. Missale Romanum, which I think in English you would say Roman Missal. And it's all in Latin. It's got this really cool black and red printing. So yeah, that's pretty cool. One of the only books I have, I guess really the only actual book I have not in English. It's all in Latin. And just, all kinds of text. I'm not sure what it's all about. But then it's got songs in here as well. The different hymns they use in Mass and everything. So that one's very cool. And then these down here are just my guitar notes/tabs books for some of my favorite albums that I've learned to play on guitar. The Red Jumpsuit Apparatus, Don't You Fake It. This album I learned in its entirety using the tabs. I don't know how to read actual proper music notation. These ones I learned a little bit of. These two Seosin albums, the self-titled Seosin album and Along the Shadow. And yeah, usually when I learn stuff on guitar, I almost always just learn by ear or maybe look up a lesson on YouTube. But for these albums being some of my favorites, I got the actual official books for them. And so that concludes the physical books on the shelf. I'll just go over the audiobooks next, and yeah, that'll be our last segment.
Alright, and so now lastly I'm going to go over my audiobooks. I have 18 of them in my Audible library. Technically it's 20, but 2 of them are repeats, which I've already shown in the shelf. The Red Book by Carl Jung and Das Buch Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. I have those in both forms, so I won't go over them again, but I'll go over the other 18. And I don't like the way they were organized in Audible, so I wrote it out on a piece of paper so I could go through them chronologically, and that's what we're going to do. Like I say, the genre of my audiobooks is almost all autobiography. There's a few exceptions. But yeah, so we'll just be going through them in chronological order when they were written. So first is The Commentaries by Julius Caesar. It's 2 separate works, but they go together. It's the commentary on the Gallic Wars and the commentary on the Civil War. that he waged in Rome that's how he became, well, he was never technically emperor, but that's how he became dictator. Um, but yeah, it's just really interesting I mean, I know war is a terrible thing, but it's really interesting to read about wars, especially ancient wars, which were very different from now, and to get it from the perspective of the man who was leading the campaigns, and just the whole psychology of the warfare, and how he was a really smart guy, and he was a really pretty logical guy, I would say, but also pretty perceptive into his enemy's mindset and being able to use that to his advantage. So yeah, those were really interesting to listen through. Then I have the Annals by Tacitus, another Roman Latin work. And I have the other book that I already showed, Germania by Tacitus, which was about the Germanic peoples. This one is just about Roman history, and I forget exactly what period it covers, but I think it's the first few centuries of the Roman Empire up to his day that he talks about. And it was rather boring, Like I say, I'm not the biggest on like history books, even if it's an ancient historian. But yeah, it was just all about what was going on with the different emperors and the relationships and the politics and all that. And then one more Latin Roman work, this from the later Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. I just heard of him, and I thought it would be pretty interesting to hear from someone who was an emperor, but also a philosopher. You don't usually see those two things together. And yeah, his Meditations, it's more maybe not meditation in the sense that we think of the word now. It's more just philosophical reflection and reflection on life and advice and things like that. Yeah, pretty good read. Next, I have the Quran, which is outside of what I would normally read, because I'm very much more interested in European things for the most part, or at least kind of Western things, I guess. But the Quran, I was just interested to listen through it to see kind of how it compared to the Bible, to the Old Testament in particular, which I'm obviously very familiar with, because those are both Abrahamic religions. Both kind of ultimately go back to the same source if you go far back enough in history. So yeah, I don't know. I found it pretty boring to listen to. It's a religious book, and it's rather repetitive, I thought. But anyway, that was an interesting look at just like almost a different side of the coin of Abrahamic religions. Some similarity and some difference. So next, now getting into the early modern period, from the 16th century, I have the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini. And he was an Italian Renaissance artist, sculptor in particular. And so he talks about his work, tends to be the focus of it. It's not so much like a modern autobiography that tries to tell the whole story of someone's life and all their inner thoughts and that kind of thing. The modern autobiography didn't exist like that yet. But yeah, he talks a lot about his work, but he also just talks about other things that he did, and it's very interesting. Like I say, I always like to get an immersive experience as close as I can to seeing what it would be like to be in historical times and what people thought and how people perceived things back then. So that was a really interesting one to listen through. Next, from the 17th century and from the 1660s in particular, is the Diary of Samuel Pepys. He was an English naval administrator working and living in London. And it's just his diary of his day-to-day life and thoughts, more of what he did, but there's some thought and introspection in there as well. But yeah, it's a long series in 3 separate volumes is how I have it in Audible. But yeah, once again, just an interesting kind of close-up, over-the-shoulder perspective of life, in a historical time. And then we get to the 18th century, and I have quite a few 18th century and 19th century works form the bulk of the autobiographies I've listened to. Next is Confessions by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That was my introduction to Rousseau. I showed one of his other books that I have, but Confessions, one of my favorite books, I would say. I listened through it in audiobook twice. It's a look into 18th century life. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a Genevan, and then he lived a lot of his life in France, and he wrote in the French language. But he was, a philosopher, but he also composed music. And so he, famously sort of began the modern autobiography, which is much more introspective and gives one's subjective perspective on things more so than just, saying oh, this is what I did in my career or whatever, So he began that whole introspective thing in autobiography. And yeah, it's really interesting because listening through it, you realize he must have been on the autism spectrum. The way he describes his thoughts and experiences, I found it very relatable in a lot of ways, similar to myself, myself being autistic. Just the way he would describe his difficulties with people and relationships, and yeah, just his sort of way of thinking and perceiving. It's really interesting, you know, getting a look into the mind of someone who thought and experienced things very similar to how I do, but in this different historical setting. Yeah, it's very cool. Next is another work by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another autobiographical book of his, a shorter one, The Reveries of the Solitary Walker. That one got, not quite so interesting to read. It's very just going on and on about his thoughts and feelings, but that was another interesting one. Then, The Story of My Life by Giacomo Casanova, which is a very long work in 3 volumes. Casanova lived in the 18th century, and I think he took his inspiration from Rousseau to write his own autobiography. And it's different from Rousseau's. It's not quite so introspective, and it's much more detailed. Casanova had a very good memory, and he just recounts in such detail, his entire life up to about 50 years old, I think. And he lived a very adventurous life, so he had a lot of interesting stories to tell about how he traveled all around Europe. He was from the Republic of Venice originally, but he traveled and lived all around Europe, had a famous escape from prison in Venice, which I wrote a song about called Under the Leads, also from my album Brundewild. Yeah, and he was a good writer, and the narrator, I'll have to put their name on screen, the narrator of this audiobook was such a good narrator. So between Casanova's writing and this guy's narrating and just all the interesting things, it was just such an entertaining listen, and just got so immersed in this 18th century world that Casanova lived in. Is really cool. And so yeah, it's 3 volumes of audiobook, very long. It took me 8 or 9 months to listen through the whole thing. But yeah, that's one of my favorite things I've ever read or listened to. Then the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which is a shorter work and not very introspective at all. It's I think he was probably rather choosy with what things he said about himself, kind of portray himself in a good way. But he was humble as well. But yeah, anyway, not the most detailed autobiography, but it was interesting to learn a little bit more about Benjamin Franklin. Then moving away from autobiography for a bit, still in the 18th century, late 18th century, I have 2 novels by Goethe. I think that's how his name is pronounced, and I think these are the only novels he wrote. The Sorrows of Young Werther, or Werther, or whatever, and Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. Sorrows of Young Werther was, quite a emotionally impactful book. It was famous for a reason, I guess. That one was a pretty good listen. Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship was just so long, and I don't know, I didn't really enjoy it. I couldn't keep track of who was who and what they were doing, and the book felt rather directionless and pointless to me. But anyway, I listened through that one. Then we get into the 19th century, Confessions of an English Opium Eater by Thomas de Quincey, 1821, and it's a story of it's a memoir, I guess you could call it, of his experience with addiction to opium, or whatever the modern word is for whatever drug he was on now. That one was pretty interesting. Short but interesting listen. Then The Voyage of the Beagle by Charles Darwin, and this was a really interesting one to listen through. It's the account he wrote of his 5-year voyage on the ship the Beagle, which was on a surveying expedition around South America. But while the ship was going around the coastlines doing its survey work, he would go on excursions inland and obviously do his scientific study of the geology and the biology and whatever. But he would also meet with local people and see their way of life, back in sort of the Wild West, so to speak, of South America. So yeah, he made all kinds of scientific observations, of course, which are in there, but just a really interesting sort of travel diary, so to speak, as well. Then Walden by Henry David Thoreau, 1854.
really cool book about, I think it was about 2 years that he spent living a simple life in a little cabin in the woods by a pond. And it's very sort of poetical and philosophical, and he's having all these reflections and things on his simple life away from civilization, and it's definitely a critique of civilization as well. So yeah, a lot of interesting thoughts there, and also just really interesting to get a little bit immersed into what it would be like to live out in the woods like he did. Then I have Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Newman, 1864, and I think that translates to a defense of one's life or defense of oneself or something like that. And yeah, John Henry Newman became a Catholic cardinal, but he was originally Protestant in the Church of England, I think, and so it's just a book about his religious conversion and his opinions on religion and things like that. Not super interesting, but I was interested in Catholicism and things like that, like I've said, so I think that's why I listened to that one. And then another Charles Darwin, The Autobiography of Charles Darwin, 1887. Rather short autobiography, kind of an overview of his life, but still interesting to see what his career was like, and of course a little bit of how the world was different in the 19th century versus now. So that was a nice little listen through. And then finally, Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung. Aside from the Red Book, this would be the only other full book I've gone through by Carl Jung. And it's his autobiography, sort of. I would say it's an autobiography. It doesn't strictly follow like a complete autobiography of his life, but it's introspective, like you would think from the title, but he describes travels he went on to different parts of the world. But yeah, a lot of it is focused, as you would expect, him being a psychologist, on his inner reflections on things and what he observed and how that influenced his work as a psychologist. And that was published 1961 or 62. I think he died in 61. I think it was published in 62. So anyway, that's all of my audiobooks and physical books, my whole library. Hopefully you found that interesting. Probably a very long video, but I like showing off these things that I have. I find it enjoyable to just go through and look through everything and talk about it. So yeah, thanks for watching.